And then we have the result that calamity can come quickly, suddenly. Quite often there may be no apparent consequences for indulging in sexual immorality, but this can quickly change. In chapter 13, verse 21, we read that disaster pursues sinners. Disaster pursues sinners. And in chapter 28, verse 18, it says, "He who is crooked in his ways will suddenly fall." And we've seen this time and again with well-known televangelists over time. Things are going along seemingly normal, and then all of a sudden they fall, or it comes to light what's been going on in the background. And so disaster comes quickly, comes suddenly. But on the other side of the coin, there are blessings of obedience in pursuing sexual purity. There are many blessings of obedience. And one is a good name, a good reputation. A person who pursues sexual purity will enjoy a good reputation with others. And in chapter 22, verse 1, we read, "A good name is to be chosen rather than great riches, and favour is better than silver or gold." And so a good reputation, a good name, particularly for a Christian, is more valuable than the riches of the world, more valuable in God's sight and also in the sight of man himself. Because once a person has a bad name or a stigma to them, that sticks to them for a long, long time, and there are many consequences which happen from that. For example, a person who's in ministry who falls in the area of sexual immorality is then disqualified for ministry. And so it has lasting effects even when a person repents of their sin. And in chapter 13, verse 18, it says that whoever heeds reproof is honoured. In other words, whoever heeds wisdom and correction and instruction and follows that will be honoured. And another blessing is, by implication, pleasing to the Lord. A person will be pleasing to the Lord. And the Lord places much value on sexual purity and pleasing Him. And we can read in chapter 16, verse 7, the following. "When a man's ways please the Lord, he makes even his enemies to be at peace with him." So there is much value in pleasing the Lord, and the Lord is greatly pleased with those who follow His ways in the path of sexual purity. And our sanctification, becoming more Christ-like, is related directly to sexual purity, and we can see this. We won't look at it now, but in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 3 to 8, our sanctification is linked to our sexual purity. And will be pleasing to parents. A wise son brings joy and satisfaction to his parents. For example, in chapter 23 of Proverbs, in verses 24 and 25, we read this. Chapter 23 from verse 24. "The father of the righteous will greatly rejoice. He who fathers a wise son will be glad in him. Let your father and mother be glad. Let her who bore you rejoice." And so parents will rejoice, get much satisfaction from a wise son who follows the path of sexual purity. And then there is peace. Following the way of purity will result in a sense of peace with God, knowing that you are following in His ways. There will be that sweet fellowship between the person and his Lord. And also it leads to long life. Now this is a general promise, not an ironclad guarantee, but a general promise. And in chapter 22, verse 4, we read this. The reward for humility and fear of the Lord, there's the concept of fear of the Lord, is riches and honour and life. Riches, honour and life follow from obedience. Life being, it can mean long life, or it can mean the quality of life with God. And so there's much benefits. And it also can lead to prosperity. In other words, finances are not spread abroad to an adulterous woman or the services of a prostitute, etc. And there's also much more chance that a man will be hard working in his job, because his focus won't be filled with the wrong things, and his lifestyle will be much more disciplined and so on. And of course there will be harmony within marriage, which is a major thing, where there is faithfulness between a husband and wife. Obviously the trust and bond between them will be maintained and strengthened over time. And we should read chapter 5 verses 15 to 19, which is about the marriage relationship and how a husband, a man, should delight in his wife, in that relationship. So chapter 5 from verse 15 to 19. Drink water from your own cistern, flowing water from your own well. Should your springs be scattered abroad, streams of water in the streets, let them be for yourself alone, and not for strangers with you. Let your fountain be blessed, and rejoice in the wife of your youth. A lovely deer, a graceful doe, let her breast fill you at all times with delight. Be intoxicated always in her love. And so this is the picture of how a marriage should be, how God designed it, that a husband is to delight in his wife and to appreciate what the Lord has given to him. And there's harmony, of course, when that's intact and when there's no adultery and sexual immorality involved. And this harmony will be maintained and fostered, and they'll be living out, the husband and wife will be living out in a practical way the one flesh relationship as God designed it from Genesis chapter 2. And then there's the Lord's protection. The Lord promises protection for those who follow and obey him. Now this doesn't mean that nothing bad will happen to a person who follows the way of wisdom, but it means that nothing will happen outside of God's will. Whatever God ordains will happen, and so God will direct a person's paths. His protection will be over them in that way. In chapter 2 verse 16 says, so you'll be delivered from the forbidden woman, from the adulteress with her smooth words. And so a person who desires the path of sexual purity and crying out to God and seeking after his wisdom and seeking to please him, God's protection will be over him to protect him from the immoral, the forbidden woman, the adulteress. And by following the path of wisdom, a person will not be unduly putting himself into the path of danger, as we talked about before. And another result is that God will give a person much wisdom, more wisdom, and increased understanding to those who desire to follow his ways. And so how do we safeguard against sexual immorality, which is a key? How does a young man or any person safeguard us against sexual immorality? First of all, there's the area of friendship. Choosing godly friends is important to encourage sexual purity. Godly friends will encourage and admonish us in pursuing the ways of the Lord. And let's read chapter 27 verses 5 to 6. Chapter 27 verse 5 and 6. Better is open rebuke than hidden love. Faithful are the wounds of a friend, profuse are the kisses of an enemy. And so a godly friend seeking after the ways of the Lord will, when need be, come alongside us and tell us the truth in love when we need to hear things which we may not need to or may not want to hear, but we need to hear. And they will encourage us, admonish us in the ways of the Lord, in the ways of sexual purity. And then the other side of the coin is avoiding evil company. Associating with evil company will eventually corrupt. Then there is the trap of thinking that you will influence them for the better. But this is very often not the case. And one such warning is in chapter 1 verses 10 to 19. We won't read that. But there Proverbs strongly encourages his son not to be closely associated with people who run after sin and evil. And Dan Phillips said the following: "We become like those whom we like. It is natural to take on the characteristics of those whom we trust and admire. Thus we must be very careful in whom we choose to embrace in close friendship." End of quote. And remembering the verse where it says that evil company corrupts good character. And we can see in the example of Solomon himself that with all the great God-given wisdom that he was given from the Lord, even with all that, he went astray. He ended up having 700 wives and 300 concubines, and his heart strayed from the Lord. And then there's accountability. A safeguard against sexual immorality is for man to make himself accountable to at least one other trusted person and to be honest and open with that person. So this way it is less likely that he'll fall when he's tempted, knowing that he'll be accountable to another person. And in chapter 27 verse 17 we read, "Iron sharpens iron, and one man sharpens another. Iron sharpens iron." And accountability is an application of that. And then there's avoiding drunkenness. The sin of drunkenness very often lessens inhibitions and leads to other sins such as sexual immorality. And such a situation tragically happened in the book of Genesis in the case of Lot with his 2 daughters. He allowed himself to get drunk, and then immorality was the result. Sexual immorality resulted after that. And so we're to avoid getting drunk on alcohol. And then we're to flee from temptation. Because of our sinful nature, we're to flee from potential situations or circumstances which may tempt us. Pride tells us we can bring ourselves to the edge of sin without falling. But this is foolish, dangerous thinking. And just to read a verse going over to 2 Timothy. 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 22. And we read here, where Paul writes, "So flee youthful passions and pursue righteousness, faith, love and peace, along with those who call on the Lord from a pure heart." And so we're commanded to flee youthful passions. And this is exactly what Joseph did in the book of Genesis. When Potiphar's wife tried to seduce him, he literally ran from the situation, ran from the temptation where Potiphar's wife was. And so he fled temptation, and we're to do the same thing. And then for those of us who are married, we're to enjoy our wife, the relationship the Lord has blessed us with, given to us. And God encourages a husband to enjoy sexual intimacy with his wife. And we just read that before from chapter 5 verses 15 to 19. And to be enraptured in love for her. And let's go back to and read that Proverbs 5 and verse 19. Just to read over that verse, which says, a lovely deer, a graceful doe. Let her breast fill you at all times with delight. Be intoxicated always in her love. Notice the word or expression, be intoxicated, which is literally to be led astray, which means this is the only time in the Bible where we're actually encouraged or commanded to get intoxicated, to be drunk, but to be drunk, intoxicated in love with our wife. And God designed sex to be enjoyed exclusively between a husband and wife. And so we're to get our fulfillment, our joy, our satisfaction in that alone, in terms of the sexual part of our lives, and that intimate relationship with our wife alone, and not with anyone else.